Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Mormon Mental Health, co-produced with Mormon Sex Info. Tonight, I have three of very good friends and colleagues with me who are going to join me on a topic that we feel is really important. There's been a letter that has been making the rounds recently, probably in the last week or two, in the Mormon internet, of an open letter to Bishop from a wife of a porn addict. And we've read through that and we wanted to kind of address that tonight. The reason why I have these panelists on is because all four of us are certified sex therapists. All four of us work quite a bit within the Mormon population, and all four of us have definitely worked a lot with people around issues of pornography viewing and how that affects their relationships, marriages, individual lives, etc. And we are also all members of the Mormon Mental Health Association, which about a year or so came out with a position statement on this very topic. So we have a lot to talk about, and I'm super excited to have them all on. Kristin Hodson, Bennion, and Shannon Hickman, and I would like for each of you to take a little bit of time to introduce yourselves.
I'm Kristin Hodson. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a certified sex therapist living and practicing in Salt Lake City. I work a lot with Mormonism and sexuality, and I'm passionate about education and teaching and just love outreach and dialogue and discussion around these topics that are really complex.
And I know that you've been fighting a really bad virus this last week, so I really appreciate you coming on, and we'll totally forgive the raspiness in your voice.
Thank you.
All right, Kristin, Marie.
Hello, my name is Kristin Marie Bennion. I'm a practicing certified sex therapist in Utah County. My practice is Orem. I work primarily with LDS clientele around issues related to sexuality, and I'm really excited to talk about this tonight with everybody. Right now I'm getting my PhD in sexuality and just have really loved learning more and more about the latest research with everything going on. And this is a really it's a hot topic, to say the least. And so any opportunity that we have to kind of put our voices out there, I'm really excited and thankful to be able to do that.
Thank you. Shannon.
My name is Shannon Hickman, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm also a certified sex therapist. I have a private practice in Murray, Utah, and I primarily specialize in couples therapy as well as sex therapy. And I do have a lot of clients who are LDS, and I see a lot of couples and individuals who have struggled with pornography issues and different out-of-control sexual behaviors. So I'm excited to be here tonight and talk about this with you ladies.
Great. Thank you all for your time and coming on. All three of you have actually been on my Mormon Sex Info show before on a variety of topics. And yeah, just really enjoy all of your work. And this topic, it was interesting because I was in the process of gathering a panel of women. I have done a lot of interviews specifically with men and a few wives along the way around this issue of sexual addiction and how that's perceived within our culture and treated, and some of the issues that go along with that. And I was in the middle of organizing this panel of, in particular, wives who have bought into the sexual addiction paradigm and may have shifted away from that, and why they have, before this article came out. But then the article came out, and I just thought we would want to have more of a professional take on it. But I still plan to post that podcast with many wives who've stepped up and said they were interested in being interviewed. So that's coming up as well. All right. So I think I just want to start off the whole podcast before we even get into things here by encouraging us all as listeners, and of course the four of us have already talked about this, that we want to very much validate the perspective from this person who wrote this letter. We understand that this person, first of all, is a wife and is not a professional. She's not a mental health professional. And she is writing to kind of from the perspective of writing to an ecclesiastical leader and how to be helpful in helping him understand her perspective as the wife of somebody who has been lying to her or not necessarily being forthcoming with some of his sexual behavior and some of the issues that come up for couples. And I will come out and say that right away that there are going to be things in this article that we actually agree with and that we'll second. But there were also a lot of things that were not necessarily clinically based, and I think that's what we also want to address. So does anybody want to further offer any disclosures or how we're going to approach this and wanting to make sure that we're not by any means minimizing pain or frustration or some of the messaging behind this letter to a bishop?
I think you covered it, Natasha.
Agreed.
Okay. And I would also like to just say that we've also agreed ahead of time that Kristin Hodson in particular is going to be willing to talk about some of this from a personal perspective as well. Kristin, is there anything that you'd like to say about that?
I'll speak from a personal perspective, and because I think it's really relevant to where I'm at now. And you'll hear my empathy deeply for these wives and these women, and I hope that comes across. That's my goal, because I do have a lot of empathy.
Which is why we wanted to address this topic to begin with, because I think much of the reason as to the problems with what is in this article or what we will try to tease out is not because this person who wrote it is not intelligent or hasn't done her research or isn't. I think that there's just a lot of really confusing misinformation out there. And so I think that this is actually a very typical response. And I think that both men and women and leaders and everybody that we're talking about are kind of set up to think about it through this lens, given our culture, given our values as a religion, etc. So anyway, with all that, let's dive in. And I think what I will do is just kind of go through some of the paragraphs and we'll take turns addressing maybe our thoughts about it. And then if one of us addresses it in a way that we feel something is being left out, the rest of us will chime in. So why don't we start with just kind of the beginning. She starts with thanking the bishop for his willingness to serve and the calling that he's serving. I think that's really important, even though I think there's issues with bishops trying to deal with these types of things that they're not necessarily trained to deal with. They obviously give their time and are oftentimes very well-intentioned in trying to help couples through these issues. So I think I would agree with that. She starts, though, with some issues around what they should expect from men coming in to confess. And so anybody want to take on this first kind of paragraph where she starts by saying that she's going to use the term addict and husband interchangeably, and please consider the following?
That was the first thing that jumped out to me, was using the term husband and addict interchangeably. I felt like the term addict, at times we can talk about these issues in a very depersonalized, very shaming way, and they're not seen as a person. They're not seen with the variety of complexities. It's an addict. And the difficulty with an addict is, according to addiction culture, you're an addict for life. And we can get to that down the road in this conversation. But just the depersonalization of interchangeably of addict and husband was something I found to be really difficult in terms of talking about the person who is struggling with these behaviors.
Exactly. I think one of the concerns for me when we're talking about specifically the term addiction with regards to anything with sexuality, what comes up for me is our really long history of pathologizing people based solely on a sexual behavior or something that's probably concerning, and I'm not going to take away from that at all. But whenever we're talking about an entire person through the lens of one concern, like Kristin Hodson was just saying, that really that narrows it way too much and minimizes to where we lose sight of the individual and the person, and in this kind of the relationship too. We lose sight of that as well. So the term addiction, I know we're going to get into it, but it's so heavily laden with problematic conceptualization. So I agree with what Kristin Hodson just said when I read that she wanted to use the term addict and husband interchangeably. It brought up some pretty big concerns for me.
And this is Shannon. I think for me, it just reiterated how shaming that language can be. And I think we have to be very careful of it. And I think we have to make a clear distinction between this is a behavior that someone's doing rather than this is who they are. And I think when we use the addiction language or label somebody an addict, it becomes more about this is who they are.
And I don't know that we want to get completely into a lot of the issues with the addiction model, because I've done plenty of interviews and podcasts on those types of topics. In fact, Kristin Hodson, I think you started off my Mormon Sex Info with podcast number 1 about the issues with seeing this whole issue just through the lens of the addiction model. So it will suffice to say that all 4 of us do not ascribe to the addiction model to treat sexual issues. Now, Shannon made a comment to begin with about out of control behavior, and we do recognize that there is a small percentage of the population that will come in with what would fit the criteria for out of control behavior, behavior that maybe has become out of balance with one's life, that feels out of control. It doesn't feel like something you can necessarily hone in on if you are wanting to do that. At the same time, most of the percentage of people that we see around these types of issues, it really ends up being more of a discrepancy between their values and their behavior, or a discrepancy between partners and what one partner thinks is okay and what the other partner might think is okay. There's just all kinds of issues that go into why these types of issues become a problem to begin with. So again, not that they don't cause pain, not that they're not real, not that they don't happen in lots and lots of marriages, but that we don't treat them from an addiction perspective, which again, there's many, many podcasts that I've provided that if you want to go deeper into why that is the case, you can do so. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't talk about some of the issues that come up in this language. All right, so let's go into these bullet points. Most men do not fully confess everything the first time or the second or the third. They may say they don't have an addiction, that it was just here or there problem. They've probably struggled for years and are only coming to you because they got caught. They've lied to themselves and to their spouse so long that they believe many of their own lies. They are so programmed to hide everything that it usually takes hitting rock bottom before full confession happens. And often there are things like masturbation and infidelity that they are not talking about. So that's a lot of bullet points. Let's start pulling them apart. What do we find that's valid and things that are not so valid?
Well, I think it's all valid. I mean, this is her perspective. This is her experience. But I think, so I'll step into the role of the personal and then what I've also seen with clients. But the third bullet point of they have likely struggled for years and are only coming to you because they got caught. When I met my husband, one of the things I said to him, and it was a point blank, hard line, if I ever catch my spouse being addicted to pornography or pain pills, those are deal breakers. It's done. And at that point, I was in my 2nd year of becoming a therapist, and it was a very hard line for me. And at that point, I'm sure my husband, or not my husband at the time, was very in love with me and knew that we were going to get married, was not going to open up or share that with me, especially years of growing up as a member of the church. And there was a split right there. And so he struggled for years, sure. But what he was struggling with wasn't pornography. It was anxiety and other mental health issues that were coming up that he had been struggling with. And I really like what David Lay talks about is men really they go down to very few coping skills. They have few social outlets, they have few social supports, and can't I really identify what was going on. And so struggling for years, absolutely. And coming to you only because they got caught, I totally can understand that, because for my husband coming clean with me or telling me or sharing, there wasn't a safe place, and it could have meant he could have lost everything. Family, kids, everything. And so I don't think that there was a scenario where he could safely talk to me about what was going on. And I don't think at that time he knew totally what was going on.
Yeah, you bring up such a great point that the system in of itself is not friendly for disclosure, right? There's going to be huge consequences. Even with the bishop, there's going to be ecclesiastical consequences. With your spouse, there might be marital consequences. I mean, it's a big deal, and we treat this as a big deal, and so therefore the consequences are fairly dire that people can be facing. So secrecy oftentimes as a companion to those kinds of scenarios that we've created as a culture, for sure. Not to excuse secrecy. I'm not trying to make an excuse. I'm just saying that's just a reality of the system.
I was just going to agree with Kristin. I think there's so much shame and guilt around it that it doesn't create a safe space for them to open up about it. But also, they don't have the necessary coping skills, and they weren't taught at a young age how to cope with maybe anxiety, depression, or any negative emotions that are coming up, especially men. This is just how our culture kind of programs them. And so this is kind of their outlet. This is what they turn to. And they don't have any other ways of dealing with it.
One of the things I was thinking when I was just listening to Kristin and Shannon speak, I love how understanding they are as they talk about what they hear when they read this. For me, another part of it is, so these bullet points that she came up with, that I can definitely see that this has been her experience, and I have so much compassion for that as well. What I have concern, I guess, is with the context that this points to is kind of a power differential that immediately comes for many of the couples that I work with, where the spouse who looks at pornography or is hiding certain sexual behaviors is all of a sudden seen through this lens, which can be seen through these bullet points, of they're immediately to be not trusted at all, and they're going to lie, obviously, and they've struggled for a really long time, and you shouldn't believe them the first time they tell. And while that might be anecdotally true for individual people who are listening to this, or their person in their life they know that has experienced these things, to have that be the conceptualization of a person who is having some conflict over sexuality stuff, I mean, I can really start to understand why secrecy seems like a pretty good idea, right? And so it kind of reinforces this cycle of secrecy, but then it reinforces that they can't be trusted, and then there's just no way out of it, at least at that time for a lot of people.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, it's interesting, just the construct of it is you're kind of already in a lose-lose situation before you even go in, because if bishops are going to have this type of outlook on people coming in, then they're already set up to not believe you, to not, this person's probably not telling me the whole truth. This person's probably not ready to do a full confession. I mean, so there's a lot of, it really is a foundation of distrust for a person to face their own ecclesiastical spiritual leader in that position. And it does also, I think, confound the problem of all of us having a right to privacy when it comes to our sexuality anyway, especially with people outside of our married partnership, or a person that we've contracted with to be sexual with. So I see that as problematic. And then there's just things in here too, like, often there are things like masturbation and infidelity that they are not talking about, almost like those two things go hand in hand. Masturbation is a pretty normal human function, and many people masturbate in private and can be considered a private act. I understand that in the Mormon context, it's oftentimes doesn't fit into our value system. Like that should be something that should not be kept in secret from a partner. But again, those are values and religious expectations. That doesn't mean that there's a clinical or diagnostic problem, and nowhere near the issue of having infidelity in a relationship. So again, just the contextual foundation is assuming a lot just in these bullet points, I think.
Yeah, I would add that I look at this and I'm like, infidelity, I could sit in front of 20 different couples, and the way that they're going to define infidelity, it can seem obvious, but I look at all of these things, and most couples and that I am dealing with, they were having sex long before they started talking about their sexual relationship, meaning they got married, they started having sex, and somewhere along the line, they may have started to have some conversations about it. But there's a lot of assumptions around what their sexual relationship will look like, and it's all assumed. Instead of going to the bishop and saying, did you ask them about masturbation, virtual relationships, physical relationships? I look at it and go, did you guys really, how much of your relationship did you negotiate and talk about and figure out? And I look at this as most likely that's another place of empathy, because not just within Mormonism, but in broad American culture, we are not taught to talk about sex at all. We're not taught to talk about what we want our relationship to look like, what fidelity looks like. That if I'm going to text a girl from work, I'm going to view that as infidelity, where someone else may say that's completely fine. That all of these questions that she's asking the bishop, I would love to say, let's go back, and how much of your relationship was negotiated? Was masturbation ever discussed, talked about? I also, what does hitting rock bottom mean? That's a lot of big words that I would love to deconstruct and understand for her and this couple of what they all mean. There's a lot of conversations that I see not being had, and a focus on behavior.
I think one other part that's coming up for me is, I want to be careful how I frame this, because like it might sound like I'm poo-pooing or disregarding the value that can come out of seeking pastoral support from a bishop and from spiritual support and assistance through these things, especially for a couple. I have so many couples that's been very, very healing and good. The way she frames this does bring up one part that I can at times have concerns about, which it presupposes that confession is absolutely necessary, and that one is expected to divulge every nitty-gritty detail in order to move through the atonement and on to bigger and better living. And to me, that kind of collides with this concern that comes up in working with so many couples, where there is no language about privacy versus secrecy. And that if you are to say, I don't know if that information is necessarily appropriate to share with a bishop, I don't feel like it's something that I want to share, then that person is really seen as they're keeping secrets immediately. Now, they might, I don't know, but it definitely deserves, I think we need some more language about the difference between privacy and secrecy, and treating people with dignity and including them in their spiritual growth and sexual growth and their development as a person and as a couple.
And Natasha, I also think that at times I'm just looking at kind of these bullet points again, and I, in this situation, I think her husband has identified himself as having a problem, but oftentimes I think it's the maybe the ecclesiastical leader or the spouse that is defining what the problem is for the individual, rather than the individual saying, okay, this is a problem for me. So I think what happens is oftentimes I'll have individuals come into my office and they're kind of like, well, I was looking at a Victoria's Secret catalog, or, I don't think I have a pornography addiction, but I'm here because everyone else thinks I do. And I think that's something to be really careful of too.
Yeah, there can be cases where there can be a certain level of denial But there are many, many cases where I think this is actually more the commonality, where, again, other people's values, other people's comfort levels are being projected onto the individual. And therefore, since I'm uncomfortable with this, or this doesn't fit my value system, therefore there's a problem with you. And again, It's hard to separate our religious, personal, spiritual values from clinical problematic behavior, especially when that behavior is very hurtful. So if your husband, for example, or wife is looking at sexually explicit material once a month or even once every 6 months, that can still be extremely hurtful if, to Kristin Hodson's point, it hasn't been contracted, it's not part of your expectations or ideas about your marriage, but it doesn't mean that there's a clinical problem. And that can be really hard for people to understand the difference between those things.
It was our quote unquote rock bottom that cracked open of me questioning and going, wait a minute, what system am I in? And I don't feel like we're getting any better. And in fact, my anxiety is going up. And it was at that moment when I started to question everything and started to move out of addiction model and started to see what else was out there. And this was before, this was right at the beginning of becoming a sex therapist, but those worlds collided. And if it weren't for what could have been seen as the end of our marriage and the rock bottom, and now in hindsight, I look at it and go, wow, that really wasn't rock bottom. It was just so new and something we hadn't discussed, but it really caused me to look at my marriage. And there was a poignant moment when I looked at my husband and said, you're not an addict. And he looked at me and he goes, I know. And I think he was waiting for me to create some space to explore what was going on. It was then and only then that we went on an entirely different path, and where I developed and he developed greater authenticity, trust, and security within our relationship.
Kristin, that's so profound, because I think so many times, she even talks about it. I can't remember if it's in her podcast or this article, but they're going on like 15 years of this. And so these people are stuck, and so many of them aren't able to get the help that they need, because this model and what's available within their belief system just it isn't working. It isn't working for them. And I think you just hit the nail on the head of how much more is out there in order to create a healing environment for these couples.
I will say, though, the moment I did discover pornography, I turned to the internet because I was in a state of panic. And what the sex addiction model does do very well is answer all the questions and concerns, and offers treatment and support and labels and diagnoses. And it offers a lot of solutions. It offers everything. And I took some comfort in that. And I will say that as much as the four of us, and there's a small group and growing group of people that support the sex positive, as a wife, there still isn't much. When I've asked people within the other model, the out of control sexual behavior, sex positive model, there's still a focus on men and their healing, and still not much for partners and or women that are struggling. And the sex addiction model it provided me a lot of comfort. It provided my husband a lot of comfort. And there was an entire system already laid out, just waiting to take us in, and a lot of support, and a lot of ecclesiastical support, and a lot of cheerleading of way to go, good job. And I found community in that moment of relationship crisis was really big. That was, in that moment, really helpful.
That, I think, is such an important point to make, because that's exactly why this is so powerful. And why, again, when I read these things, it doesn't make me angry at the person who wrote it, right? Like, I totally get where she's coming from and why she would feel as passionate as she does about what she writes, and why it makes total sense, right? It makes sense. And the recovery and addiction information fits the narrative of the LDS sexual value system. So it's super easy to buy into it. And, the other model, which is more about, well, there could be a variety, a myriad of things going on here. Well, yeah, there is no book with the myriad of possibilities, right? Well, it could be depression, it could be marital contracting, it could be a personality disorder, it could be, there just isn't the same. The addiction model simplifies it. It makes it, like you're saying, a very digestible and program-friendly approach, which I think, again, as Mormons, we kind of like that. We like following manuals, we like to-do lists, we like behavioral accountability, and it fits right into all of those things that we're actually pretty good at as a culture. So that's an excellent point.
One of the things that I'm hearing is that I think might be important to point out, if people are tuning into this, maybe the first time or something, you haven't heard any of us talk about this at length, especially you, Natasha. But one of the things that I often see happen either on the sidelines or personally is one of the things we're demonstrating is a significant amount of compassion for people who have been labeled as an addict or feel as though they might be, quote, an addict, and then also their partner if they're in a relationship. And over the years, I've seen a lot of people perceive that as permission and anything goes. And so therefore, there's like a perception that maybe we're up here saying that there's no problematic aspects about pornography, or that it can't cause problems with a couple or a relationship, so just stop worrying about it. And that's, I know all three of you very well, and I can speak for myself that in no way, shape, or form is what we are saying. But I wanted to kind of label just this compassion that over the years I think all of us have really grown to have significant amounts of over this topic.
I appreciate you saying that as well, because that's, I think, the most common pushback I get is, well, you don't buy into the addiction model, therefore now you are a porn lover or a minimizer of trauma, or, somehow permissive. And it really isn't about that at all. It's more about, yes, this can be an issue for many people on a variety of scales, right? The spectrum is very large, and for a variety of reasons that are oftentimes complex. And here are some maybe better approaches than the addiction model to start looking into that. And
absolutely,
that's at the base, I think, of what we're saying. Well, and the other thing, and we've already fallen into this even as we talk about it, is that this whole model and the whole way that we talk about this issue to begin with is very male-centric, right? So we've been talking about men and the wives as victims, and it's definitely true that these treatment centers and all these kinds of places that treat this type of issue, it becomes more of a male-centric problem. So that in of itself is one of the critiques of this model. And then as we go into the next paragraph, she talks to the bishop about considering asking the difficult questions. And she asks quite detailed questions that she now expects the bishop to be asking. And so I'd just like to gather everybody's thoughts on that, of having a non-therapy, non-trained, non-sexually trained ecclesiastical leader asking some very, very detailed questions that she lays out here as far as what the partner may or may not have been involved with.
I'm trying to frame this really delicately, so I try not to offend anybody, but I think this is where we have to be really careful, because the bishops, they do the best that they can do, but they don't have the training or expertise. So sometimes this can feel very violating to individuals. And I think if they don't have the right tools, these questions can be traumatic for the individual that they're being asked. And I think sometimes it's important to maybe know, what's happening or the triggers, but I use a very specific model, and you don't necessarily have to go into how many times or details like this in order to help somebody with this concern or these problems. And I think that's the concern I have with it.
I would say, more appropriate questions from an ecclesiastical leader would be something along the lines of, do you feel like there's been secrecy between you and your spouse? Do you feel like there's some sexual issues that need to be worked out between you and your spouse? Do you feel like this is impinging on the worthiness of your ability to maybe hold the temple recommend? I mean, these seem more ecclesiastically appropriate questions, and then to refer out, right? So that if the answers come back like, yes, we are having sexual problems, one of us feels like maybe there's been a betrayal, or one of us or both of us feel that way, that then the referral be given out to a professional who can actually do the assessment piece that you're talking about, Shannon, in a way that they've been trained specifically to do around those things.
And to be honest with you, our bishop that helped us do this didn't want to ask those questions. Again, because he hasn't been trained. Like, none of us were taught how to talk about sex, and it can be somewhat awkward. And the little they did get into it, while I appreciate her offering of those questions, I really liked your questions, Natasha. I think those would be really helpful. As much as our bishop tried to help, he really did. He would say, okay, now I just need you to try and count steps and do those things, like count steps instead of think about pornography. Like, if you're struggling with it, just start counting steps. And these questions, I don't know. Let's say they answered yes to all of them. Then what? Then what? Then where do you go? And I feel like the stewardship of the bishop to help the souls and the relationship can work really well. I think all of us work with bishops in tandem, where they are working on the spiritual aspects and we're working clinically, and I hold the confidentiality and privacy there. But I'm not sure how these specific questions, what the outcome would really be and how productive or helpful they would be. Really, I don't know.
Especially given the dynamics of how our ecclesiastical leadership works in Mormonism, which means it's it's not like you have a priest or a pastor who will be in that position until, for the next 20 years. And oftentimes these can be people that you know outside of your social circle. It can be somebody you work with. It can be somebody who you've been friends with prior to them becoming the bishop. So to have really detailed information about your sex life in this type of a setting, I think is really inappropriate. And it's not necessary in order to gauge worthiness or those kinds of things that I know bishops are in that position of having to consider what steps are going to be taken moving forward.
You just nailed one of the kickers, I think, that I found over doing this over the years, is that it's not necessary. And so might some people feel that it's important to address these things with their, these specific questions that she outlines? Sure, and that's up to them. That might be helpful in their own process. But when it is framed as it is right here in what we're reading right now, it turns into what feels like a game of gotcha. And that is, I don't know if any of us would really, I certainly wouldn't agree that that's going to invite someone to participate in a healing process that's basic. It sounds just very like they're just not really having a say in what they're talking about. And these are very, very intimate, private things.
And that people are not trained in confidentiality matters. And again, oftentimes there's disciplinary councils, and now there's more people involved who are also part of your community. It just gets really, really tricky. So I think that it's very hard to, and it again goes back to why it's so simple to understand why secrecy is oftentimes a way that people self-protect, even though they probably at some level understand that that's also impinging on the intimacy, and probably feel bad about that as well. So let's move on then to this number 1, which she's talking about. Please don't imply or flat out say that if we, meaning the wife, would give our spouse more sex, that he wouldn't have this problem. And this is something that I've actually heard a lot of women that are concerned about sexual issues are in one way or another told this by an ecclesiastical leader, that the only reason why that your husband's looking at porn or had an affair or anything, any type of issues. Masturbating is because obviously he's not happy in the bedroom. And this is, I think, really problematic. Sexual behaviors are complex, and there's lots of reasons why people act sexually in different ways. And putting the onus or the responsibility on one person's behavior on the partner is really not very well guided. So, thoughts on this?
I totally agree with her on this one. I totally agree that spending more time sexually, sex can obviously be used also, though, like in a withholding way or a power play. But I did have a moment with our bishop where I said, given our circumstances that I won't go into, I'm going to no longer engage in sex with my husband. And he was really concerned and was worried about the worth of his soul and what was going to happen to him, at which point I just looked at him and said, I appreciate the worth of his soul, and the worth of my soul is equally as great. And I need this for myself right now. And I don't think, like she says, I'm highlighting it right here. And it may be difficult to understand this, but the addict does not know how to deal with life, and pornography, masturbation is his coping mechanism. This, what she's saying is it's not about the sex. Right above that, she says it's not about the sex. As we said earlier on, it can be a myriad of other things, a lot of things. It can be relationship issues. It can be personal, mental health. It can be trauma. It can be a variety of things. And there can be really limited ways to cope. So cutting out and having the partner having an assumption that they need to give more sex or wherever that can go, I do not believe is helpful. It doesn't solve the problem. And as therapists, I would like to dare say that none of us would recommend that as a solution to a problem that would be presenting with this.
Hear, hear. I totally agree.
Like, to your point, sometimes you need boundaries, especially if you are going through a betrayal or a miscommunication, or there's a lot of pain and hurt. Yet you're probably not going to be having sex during those times, or you might not be having sex during those times. Some people still do, some people don't. There's boundaries that people need to place. Sometimes there can be it can be obviously, like if you have a libido discrepancy, if you have a difficult time talking about the frequency or the style of sex. I'm not saying that there aren't people who may not use erotic materials or masturbation as a way to cope with those relational problems. But again, that doesn't mean that it's the spouse's fault, or that now the onus is on them to start doing things that they're uncomfortable with, because otherwise their spouse is going to masturbate and look at pornography, right? So again, these are really complex dynamics that are best, and even for us who are trained, are very tricky to know how to talk about them in a way that both people feel validated, heard, that both feelings matter, right? I mean, this is like at the heart of what couples work is about. It's complex.
It's very complex. And in that moment, I just needed stewardship over, like, what do you have for me? What are my help? What's my support? Because it seems like there's a lot of support for the men. I just needed some support. And I was right as you said that. It is complex. Couples counseling is really complex. It's not just it's not individual counseling by adding another person to the room. It changes the whole dynamic. And many of us as therapists get ongoing years in training and continue to get training to work out couples counseling. It's so complex. And so it's not an easy endeavor, even for the trained.
And I think this piece is very, very delicate when it comes to couples. And I want to validate what Kristin's saying about her experience and what she's saying here about it not being the wife's duty or her job to kind of fix this. But what I do oftentimes with these individuals, and sometimes with a couple, if I'm seeing the couple, is really take a look at it. If there is anything, oftentimes it's that the individual can't be open and honest with something that's in their erotic template, and that isn't the wife's fault by any means, or the spouse's fault. But I work on trying to help them navigate that, because oftentimes that's a conversation. I think you mentioned it a little bit, Natasha, but that's a conversation that can be brought into the room in a very delicate way at certain points during treatment, but it can help the couple to be closer and connect better sexually. And sometimes that is the root of some of what's going on, but if there is a problematic sexual behavior happening.
And this is one of the complications of monogamy, right? Is that when we're expecting our sexuality to be in the realm of you and me have a hard time deciding what's okay and what isn't, or different, like I said, tastes or frequencies. It's just, that's a challenge for anybody. It's a challenge most monogamous couples are going to have. It's just a natural challenge. And since we've already talked about how difficult it is to talk about these sexual negotiations to begin with, it isn't uncommon that people might use other ways that a partner might find as a betrayal. And again, that doesn't make it okay. It doesn't make it a clinical issue, but it is definitely a relational one. And both have very valid feelings there to be dealt with. It's very tricky. All right, let's move on then to counsel with husband and wife individually at first. Any thoughts to this point? I just get caught up again in the language. She talks about sobriety and recovery. And so it's hard to parse out some of the valid points with the language that is holding everything kind of hostage in my point of view.
I'm surprised it hasn't come up yet, but for me, it's just a lot of overgeneralization with all husbands are like this or all addicts are like this. And so maybe it's not speaking right to, maybe I'm not commenting on number 2, but just the language that I also get kind of caught up in is unwilling to be vulnerable and just kind of implying that most that are experiencing this are that way, quote unquote. And so, yeah, it's just that's kind of tough. I imagine ecclesiastical leaders reading this, and I just worry that immediately when someone hears that a concern with pornography is in the room, that they are going to be talking to that person through this lens, and that is concerning to me.
I really like that, Kristin, of the overgeneralization, and I think I bring up this article in every single podcast I do because I think it's such a big win in changing, even if it's a small step in changing the way we can talk about and discuss out of control sexual behaviors. But in the 2015 conference edition of the Ensign, Elder Oaks talks and puts pornography use on a spectrum. And at the very end, like you said earlier, Natasha, at the very end, he talks about some people are going to get to the point where they need treatment. And he puts addiction in parentheses. And it's not even discussed. I believe he says out of control sexual behavior. And I think that's really big. And I think it's really big, the idea of the sobriety, recovery, addiction, the addict brain. In that article, that Ensign article, Healing from the Trap of Pornography, he talks about it. So there's so much more nuance to it. There's so much more nuance. And I think this also, there's a big assumption of what is an addiction. And there are people that identify as an addict if they look at pornography 4 times a year. They can't stop. They feel guilty. It's ruining their marriage. It meets all the technical criteria, to people that are breaking their marriage contract and they are having an affair and they are going out to and engaging in things that they haven't contracted or negotiated. But there's very little nuance and it feels very black and white, overgeneralization and packaged up. You said it earlier, it's really packaged up and simplified. And sexuality is not that. It is nuanced. Relationships are nuanced.
Probably the one sentence I would agree with her here is the last one. She says, if you're meeting with the couple, do not use it as a time to side with one spouse or another. I think that is important, to not villainize one or the other. Either the spouse who isn't giving up enough sex or the spouse who is a complete awful person to the other person. So that's good advice, because it can be really easy to make assumptions that just aren't even the case. And everybody's, each couple is so different to begin with.
I agree. I'm really glad she said that. And I'm glad you pointed that out too, because I definitely agree with that part as well.
moving on to bullet point number 3, a woman's recovery is separate and distinct from her husband's. And there's a lot here I agree with. Again, it's just, this is why it's so frustrating, because on her good points, it's just the underlay of the addiction language, right? That just problematizes it for me. So again, using the word recovery, I would say the woman's experience is separate and distinct from her husband's. And of course, looking at it from a male-centric, it could be the husband's. The husband's perspective is different and experience is different from the wife. There are wives who enjoy sexual explicit material, right? There are husbands who are upset with their wives' behavior sexually. So again, the fact that this whole premise is that it's always going to be the wife who's upset with the husband is problematic for me too. But we probably don't need to mention that again. But it's just
Natasha.
hard.
That was something that really stood out for me. I do have, I would say probably generally I have more men, but I've seen a lot of women in my practice in my office that have had or are self-identified as having problematic sexual behaviors. So I do agree that that's an important thing to address at least once.
Yeah, and so she talks about helping them spiritually, and I do agree with this. I've talked to many couples where the husband gets the label of the addict, and now the husband is meeting with the bishop every week, and the woman is never asked back. The wife is never asked back, and she feels maybe isolated or not important. And then there's other women that are like, thank goodness, I don't want to go back. I don't want to talk about this, right? So again, it's going to be individual. Some people are maybe going to feel like they want more ecclesiastical support than others. So I wouldn't necessarily encourage bishops to just have a formula that everybody goes through the same way. It's more about asking the wife, asking the husband, would you like to see me more often? Is this a safe space for you? Would you like to have a blessing on a regular basis? It's scheduled so that you can feel support. If they say, no, I'd prefer not to have that. Well, would it be okay if I checked in with you 3 months down the road then, or something along those lines. So not just assume that everybody's going to want the same thing.
I agree with you. And I was just looking at just the very first bullet point. Although our spouse may not be worthy to go to the temple, the wife should not be denied access. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that if that's something that's been good for her and brings her comfort, that she shouldn't have any type of space in kind of being lumped in with him and whatever consequences he's having to go through.
Yeah, and I wonder sometimes what even promotes that type of bullet point to be written to begin with. And it concerns me, like back to her other point that maybe a wife would be held responsible for not having enough sex and therefore is disciplined. Or, unfortunately, there's really some sad stories out there of ecclesiastical misstep or even abuse. So absolutely, there should not be any disciplinary repercussion for the spouse of somebody who has overstepped behaviorally.
I really like her third bullet, assisting us in setting and maintaining boundaries. I really like hearing someone ask for support in doing that, because I think that is probably going to be needed, and hopefully in a way that's promotive of healthy sexuality and healthy relationship overall. But I like that bullet point, just the concept of it's on there.
And she'll talk about this later, but I think where that oftentimes goes awry is with this idea of forgiveness. Like, well, it's our job to forgive. And oftentimes that's conflated with not having boundaries. Like, it's okay to go back to the status quo or to prior behavior where, like, as Kristin Hodson mentioned, sometimes you really need your own space, your own time. That's perfectly appropriate. And forgiveness and boundaries do not need to be really in the same sentence at all.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening gone. The sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.